Welcome to Don't Fuck This Up, the podcast answering the ultimate question, how the fuck did you land that cool job? I'm your host, Lauren Alvarez. Wow, it is episode 10, and we've got a great show in store for you as we welcome today's guest, Mary Connelly. Mary is an executive coach with a career hallmarked by multiple successful pivots that took her from bartending at one of the only restaurants in Chelsea to an ascent in the editorial and publishing world that includes working as the American fashion director at Vogue. Today, she's the founder and executive coach of her namesake consultancy, Mary Connelly Consulting. Mary, welcome to Don't Fuck This Up.
Thank you so much, Lauren Alvarez. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I mean, it feels like it's been a long time coming. I mean, it's really super excited to have you on as a guest because I feel like so much of your focus is on other people, on, coaching others. And, even the coach needs a coach. And so, that's how I, came to you and sought out your, wizardry. But what I've noticed since we've started working together, I mean, your background reads somewhat like a fantasy novel, as in it's my fantasy of having so many points of evolution. I mean, you've worked extensively in the editorial and publishing industry. You co-founded a canine rehabilitation center in New York. I mean, you were a chief revenue officer. For the last several years, you've been a talent development and executive coach. I mean, that's wild. But the thing that maybe people wouldn't see if they were on your LinkedIn or on your website, you started out as a bartender.
I did.
That's pretty interesting.
Much to my mother's chagrin after my college education.
Yeah.
It helped support my paying tuition through college, was waitressing and bartending in New York City.
Really? And so when you were diving into that, it was really just about the monetary component and supplementing where you were at in your current life.
Absolutely. It was the 1980s in New York City. I was thinking a lot about the name of your podcast, the topics that you cover, of which I'm enjoying tremendously, the personalities you're having on. And one of the earliest instances for me about not fucking something up was when I went on a random interview to work at Hamburger Harry's in New York. Hamburger Harry's was exactly like it sounds. It was like a burger chain in New York City in the 80s. There weren't a lot of them. It was privately held.
Okay.
And I met with the owner. And after meeting with me, I didn't have a ton of bartending experience. I had a little bit. Okay. And after meeting me, he said, I have another restaurant. I would like you to maybe train there. And I was like, okay. And then he told me the restaurant, and it was a really established New York City, New York Times 2-star restaurant called Claire in Chelsea. And back in the 80s in Chelsea, there were only a handful of restaurants. Now it's, there were dozens on every block, but it was one of the only ones. And the thing that was interesting about Claire was it catered to a gay clientele. And heterosexuals who were comfortable being around gays in the early 80s. It wasn't a big thing if you went to Claire. You didn't feel like you were being outed. That was the place to go. So being a lesbian, I was like, wow, oh my God, that would be amazing. And I got really afraid. And then I was like, oh my God, don't fuck this up. Because I knew I didn't have a ton of bartending experience, and I was on my way there to train behind the bar.
I mean, he obviously saw something in you. Yeah. I mean, did he ever reveal what it was? Did you ever get to the bottom of that where he was like, you're not a bartender, but you'll be a great one?
Well, I think he did see potential. And Marvin and I, his name is Marvin Page. He's passed since, but we had an interesting relationship. He gave me a lot of leeway. There was something about our relationship that felt very almost intuitive. He was a very intimidating personality.
How
known
so?
To rage. Oh, known to rage.
Okay.
Like if things weren't going his way. And I never experienced it in the 6 years I worked there, really.
Wow.
And, it was an interesting time in the 80s in the LGBTQ community, which back then it was LG and be, and I say that because there was so much divisiveness. Men went to their bars, women went to their bars. I was the first woman he ever hired to be behind the bar of a restaurant that was populated 95% by gay men.
And what was that like for you? Was that something that was already in your comfort zone, or had you spent much time in that community since it was so divided?
I spent a lot of time in that community. I lived with gay men. They were many gay men were best friends of mine, most of whom have passed on now through that crisis. And so the men there were unfamiliar with me and resented having a woman behind the bar for about 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay, so you built a rapport pretty quick.
They, first of all, my name is Mary. And back in the day, how many times did I have to hear, Mary, that's a boy's name? And I was like, oh my God. And I would laugh along with it to let them know that it wasn't a big deal. And I actually cultivated quite a bit of rapport and regulars. And I made Marvin a lot of money, to be perfectly honest. And I
owners tend to like that.
Position. Sure. The other thing was that being at Claire then, as the AIDS crisis was building, this was 1986. So it was really, AZT was just recently a drug that people were beginning to take that was, not stopping the spread, and people were dying pretty rapidly even during that. And so while at Claire, we started doing fundraising, and it was really the burgeoning part of becoming more AIDS immersed in that I was volunteering at Gay Men's Health Crisis. I was going to 3 memorials a weekend. Over the course of 5 years there, so many men were dying. And friends of mine were passing pretty rapidly. And during that period, it led me to my career in publishing. So I look at the times, the common thread of how Claire actually was the birthing of my career in publishing and marketing and sales. Because it was at Claire I met Michael Goff and Sarah Pettit, who had the idea to launch a gay magazine. Ironically, they said it would be a general interest magazine along the lines of Vanity Fair for people who were proudly out. And you would be really good in ad sales. And I was like, I don't know shit about ad sales. I'm a bartender.
But you are kind of selling something, right?
Being relational, enjoying talking to people. And so my bartending skills really informed my ability to move into ad sales and understand and explain the gay market authentically to corporate America way before, Will and Grace or Ellen wasn't even out. This is the beginning.
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting journey. One thing I want to, ask is you were working so immersed in this community, during such a pivotal moment that was really steeped in sadness. There was a lot of people passing on at a rate that was, much higher than anything we've seen since, in that specific community. When you're working in an environment where people come to forget, people come to let go, they come to move past something, you're also experiencing this outside of work and you have your own feelings. Were you putting that to the side? Were you dissociating from those feelings? Were you letting it dictate the conversations that you had with patrons? How did you function through that time?
I was in my late 20s, and I remember waking up one day really hungover. I'd been out drinking margaritas with friends from work after we closed the restaurant.
As one does sometimes.
As one does. As one does. And I woke up and I got I just felt like crap, like a hangover will do to you. And then later that week, one of my partners, they called them buddies back then, at GMHC, was somebody I was responsible to if they were having a tricky day. And he contacted me and said he had attempted suicide that morning and it didn't work. And could I come meet him? And we sat in a cafe in the West Village and we chatted, and I helped get him supported him to get him to his therapist's office because it was like a Saturday and he needed to see his therapist, obviously, because I'm not a therapist. And I remember thinking at the time, you have to stop drinking because you have to be available for these calls. This was a few days after the bad hangover, but it was a wake-up call to me.
Yeah.
That if I was going to be available to others, I had to be conscious.
It's that's so interesting that you say that.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And say more.
And so, I spent a number of years standing behind a bar with people who did need that release and decompressing, working on trying to be available and present. We were really, I did a post on this at LinkedIn referencing it. We were really also energized by the community and the support we had. So it was as sad and upsetting as it was to have to be in the midst of so much confusion and loss and devastation to the community. It also energized us dramatically to be of support to each other. And I will say it was one of the best times of my life in a really complicated way.
Yeah. I mean, and I think sometimes in those moments of difficulty, it sort of forces us to put the bullshit aside and really to be available for other people.
Yeah.
And, obviously that's not the only time that that's occurred in your lifetime or, and I can think of examples in mine, but, there is something that's very uniting about tragic moments. And so being able to move through that, much like your career transitions, I mean, it sounds like you've also transitioned yourself in order to be more available to other people as needed, but also available to yourself to say like, what the fuck am I thinking right now? Like what's happening right now?
Yeah. And I have to say it helped me have the courage, or let's just say ignorance is bliss, maybe the ignorance to say yes to Sarah and Michael about being part of the launch team for Out, because I literally said, I know nothing about this. And I remember Michael had rented half a loft space in Soho back when you had no money. That's also, a fond memory. We had this half a loft space right on Broadway and Bleecker. And they had a fax machine. So I didn't know how to use a fax machine. I'd never worked in an office before. So I was like picking up the phone handle. I'm like, wait, it transmits documents? And, I was used to being behind a bar. Yes, folks, before email, we transmitted documents like, literally through machines that the text would come in and out. And I had to learn how to take orders from clients that I was calling on who wanted to advertise in the magazine.
It's incredible. So you worked in ad sales.
I worked in ad sales. I learned a boatload about marketing.
Yeah.
Within about 2 years, Conde Nast started calling to see if I'd be open to interviewing there. And I was extraordinarily intimidated by that. It was, for me, a really heteronormative environment. I didn't dress in a heteronormative way. I hadn't owned a dress in at least 10 years. I was a lesbian working in the gay market, introducing the gay market to corporate America. And that was a big comfort zone for me.
Yeah.
So I was highly intimidated. And I went through several rounds of interviews at Conde Nast and then always pulled myself out if they were interested in me, and always made up some excuse as it not being the right time until it felt like the right time.
And did you actually change your way of dressing when you went in for these interviews? I'm so curious.
No.
Okay, good. So you were authentically you.
I went in, usually like a Calvin Klein suit or a Paul Smith suit that was bought in the men's department that I had tailored to fit my body. And I was in the elevator once at Conde Nast. I'd been there now for a while and working at Vogue, and somebody in the elevator had introduced me to another woman in the elevator and said, Jenny, or whatever her name was, do you know Mary? And I said, hi, how are you? And she said, of course I do, the most recognizable woman in the building. And it was her kind of offhanded way of saying, yes, you don't fit in, but I'm happy to meet you.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
wasn't offended, but I was cracking up saying, okay, noted,
Yeah, wow. Like thanks for the input.
Yeah,
I can tell
yeah,
you where I get my suits and who
yeah,
tailors them. Yeah,
yeah,
thanks very
exactly.
much. Yeah.
No, it was fine, but I had gone through a lot of, working at Out Magazine and going into corporate America. I had a lot of much more challenging instances, in
Yeah.
navigating that. So that was nothing.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that it's interesting because working at also the first ever of a magazine that is, breaking into the more corporate market without
Mm-hmm.
magazine, and then something that's so, I'll say expected as, like people really expect specific content. What was their hope in bringing you over, into
Yeah.
that arena, coming from such a specific market? Was it to expand their footprint in that community, or was it to try to get you to give it up? And, did they have a different
We
agenda?
we had a lot of success at Out, particularly with the alcohol market.
Interesting.
But corporate America first, like an Absolute, in their heyday, with their keen marketing campaigns, were
Right.
really good at micro targeting communities and groups of people. And there was no lack of insight that gay people enjoyed being around gay people, and that primarily happened in bars and clubs and
Yeah.
restaurants like there. And heterosexual or companies that were afraid of the gay market because of drug use and AIDS and things like that, and pornography that shied away from it, were interested in what was perceived to be a safer entry into the gay market, because we didn't accept 800 numbers as an example. We wanted to present a side that was a little more well-rounded. We wanted to present people who were creatives. We wanted to present people who were captains of industry, people who were changing things that were happening in the world. And we wanted to help share that narrative of people who were proudly out. And so the interest came first through spirits companies. And when they saw how many spirits companies I was being able to bring into the magazine, the spirits companies wanted to know more, and Conde Nast wanted a piece of that. So it started there, but I also was calling on fashion and retail companies like Saks Fifth Avenue and Calvin Klein, and they were all coming in as well. And then
Well, you had to have somewhere to get your suits. I mean, come on, Mary.
I had to have somewhere to get my suits. And exactly. And my Gucci loafers and things like that. So, at the time they were aware that we were getting business that they were having a harder time cracking depending on the brand. And that's when I first said yes by going to Details magazine, which felt like, it was a young men's magazine. I knew a lot about the men's market. And it was, they used to say it was like GQ's little brother. It was cooler than GQ back then.
Yeah.
And it felt like an easier entree for me to go to because of their nightlife focus and their alternative focus. And it was amazing. It was actually a really great segue for me once I finally left Out.
I mean, and I think for you, like you've had so many positions that have helped to define this professional approach that you have, in what you're doing today. And oftentimes, with guests, we end up talking about the through line of like what's thematic, but what was, some of like the better experiences like that you feel yourself referencing today? Because I mean, you spoke about bartending. I'm sure that comes up a lot because I can see how that would work. But is there a specific thing that you pull from that you think the most from one of your past roles in your role today? Or is it a mix of everything?
As a coach now, as somebody, coach means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And
it's very
everybody
subjective,
out there,
yes.
It's very subjective. And I think of myself more as somebody who helps figure their career shit out. Yeah. Literally, that's, somebody asked me, what do you do? I'm like, I help people figure their career shit out. And I think for me, when I'm working with someone, I'm always trying to find out what motivates them.
Yeah.
And what inspires them. And I think that gets lost. When you're doing your day job, it's very hard not to look at signposts that are supposed to direct you in a certain way. If I get certified in this, I will be eligible to get promoted to that. Or if I work in a company like this, I will have a career that looks like that. And I think what people lose is what feels authentically, like what really feels good to you when you're doing it.
Yeah.
Right. And the part of bartending and the part of sales that felt good to me was being relational, problem solving. Because when you're in sales, generally, depending on the sort of sales you do, you're helping a client solve a problem. I have a need to do X. Can you help me do that? My product can, my platform can, my, whatever. And I gravitate toward people who have identified that something's off. And sometimes they think they need to double down on another skill set. And I think often they have to double down on getting in touch with what really inspires them.
Yeah.
What moves them from day to day? How does that shape who they are and how they navigate?
Yeah.
All areas of their life. And for me, one of the things that was illuminating when I was getting certified, I went to NYU for approximately a year to get my diploma in coaching. And we did this exercise called systems theory. And if you look it up, it's going to take you in all sorts of directions because it means a lot of things to different industries. But they use it a lot in family therapy.
Okay.
Which I was completely unfamiliar with. And it was the closest explanation. It's where you get to the core understanding of your identity, which was appealing to me, and you unpack it from the perspective of how you identify today, and if you're living your identity in an authentic way. And as a coach, coaches are not therapists, and I have that in all my contracts. We're not there to therapize anybody. But if somebody needs to unpack something about their identity that they've been carrying with them a long time, I can really relate to that.
Yeah.
Because as I matured and got promoted and got elevated in companies, I often had to really tap into why me? The imposter syndrome would come up. I was this kid from a working class background in the Bronx. And next thing you know, I found myself responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue at Conde Nast. And I would really have moments of insecurity in that moment. And I would really have to shore up. What is it that I'm telling myself that says I'm not supposed to be here? I've worked with clients who don't have college educations and they're hugely successful. One of my closest friends said to me, I have no idea how I'm a chief marketing officer. I didn't even go to college. I'm like, that has nothing to do with it.
Right.
It has to do with your creativity, your strategy, your smarts, your resilience, and your ability to show up and say, what about? What about this? What about that? It's asking questions. So,
yeah. And I think we recently had an interesting post, I don't know, maybe a few months back, I remember seeing on social about imposter syndrome and saying that people often diagnose themselves with having it, right? And it's like a self-diagnosis. And as a coach, you also talked about, it usually stems from something that's uneasy. Someone starts to question their own capabilities. I mean, can you speak about what advice would you give someone who feels like they don't belong in the position that they've, earned their way to be? Is there a blanket statement advice here, or is it really specifically diagnosed based on someone's, what makes them them?
I have found that the people who fall into the thinking that maybe they haven't earned their way, maybe they're intimidated to go for that next promotion because of X. It's so narrative based. And it's not necessarily true. I have found that if you encourage someone to take stock of their achievements and what got them from A to Z, they have forgotten so many things that they did, that they paid attention to, that they studied, that they executed, that they created, that they talent or skill or nuance be different in any given moment, other than you're telling yourself, but not this.
I mean, I think it can be really hard. Sometimes like, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm definitely someone I think if anybody's listening and they haven't experienced imposter syndrome, please let us know your secret. I have no
Yeah,
idea,
totally.
but I think that it is something where you're excited because you're at a place that feels like there's growth, but you're
Hmm.
also like, holy shit, I'm now doing this dance for the first time on stage in front of a packed house, and
Yeah.
that's kind of the environment. You don't get to do this in private. A really great conversation that I had on the show recently was with Kirsty Godso, and she talked about it's okay to work in private. It's okay to like plot
Hmm.
your next steps privately. But
Hmm.
sometimes we're not given that opportunity in the work environment. We're asked to step out and sing the
Hmm.
song the first day we learn it. And
Right.
so I do think that there's those moments where we do question, where am I going with this, or why am
Sure.
I doing this? And so what's kind of the assessment that is like, there's imposter syndrome, and then they're like, do I want to fucking do this thing I'm being asked to do? Right? There's
Right.
two different things. How do you distinguish between the two in those moments?
Oof. That's a really good question. I don't think this answers it. I will say that I have in the past asked myself, and I've asked clients who were thinking maybe I shouldn't go for this, or maybe I can't do it.
Hmm.
I always go to what's the worst thing that could happen. And I remember standing outside of the Conde Nast building back when it was at 4 Times Square with my work wife, who's one of my closest friends, Anjali Lewis. And we were standing outside having a cigarette break. I don't smoke, but she used to.
And you needed a break.
And I needed a break. And, she was my work wife. So we always, supported each other through walks around the block. And there was an opening at Conde Nast at Vanity Fair, which is where I was working. And it was to be the number 2, to be the associate publisher. And she looked at me and she said, so, and I said, so what? And she goes, do you want it? And I think I broke out right there in like a sweat because I was being presented with by one of my best friends. What are you waiting for?
Mm.
And the pressure I felt to step into going for something that there was a voice in the back of my head saying, can you do this? I was like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And I went for it and I was chosen. And there were a couple of other candidates. And it was one of the best positions I've ever had in my career. And my point is, I think of that a lot when people say to me, when I say, what's the worst thing that can happen? They often have an answer. Oh, well, they could hire someone else and then they'd report to them. I'm like, you want to do that?
Right. Are you talking about, I think I said that to you before. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I've said that.
It's taking stock of, the variables and really taking a calculated risk and saying, if I don't put myself out there, how much will you regret this?
Would you say this is the source of confidence for you when you're navigating these larger transitions, or who or what supports you during those bigger changes? Because those are those big moments. And sometimes, yes, we have someone to gas us up on a text message or give us a call and say, hey, you're going to kill that interview. And other times you're just doing it solo. So what's that for you?
The memory of when I didn't try and I was too afraid to do it.
Fuck, that's really good. That's really good.
And the first time was when I was in high school, it was being president of the student council, and I'd been on the student council for 4 years, and I decided not to run. And I've always looked back on that because there was a part of me that thought somebody smarter should have had it. And a really smart person got it. Nancy Saffone went on to be an attorney. Really brilliant, like high school memory of always straight A's. And how much I regretted that I didn't run for president of the student council. And there's a couple of others like that if I'm 61 and I am, and I can still remember that like it was fucking yesterday.
Yeah.
That was a moment where I didn't try and my mother was disappointed. Like, why didn't you do it? I thought you wanted it. And I was afraid for some reason. I was afraid. And I look back on moments like that, and some of them are really primary. And those are what's the worst thing that can happen? You can carry it with you for 50 years or 40 years. Who wants to do
I mean,
that?
and that's a drag. Totally. Like imagine what
Totally.
else you could be thinking about
Sure.
vacation instead of that. Yeah,
Totally.
totally.
It's the memory of the few times I was too afraid to give it a shot.
I mean, and how do we pay attention? How do we know when it's that opportunity? And it is so subjective. I realize that's such a
Yeah.
wide question, but
Yeah.
when we're paying attention and our feelers are out there, what's that signal we should look for? Is it that gut feeling? Is it that like, am I going to regret this? Or is there something else that's a little more rooted in, the pragmatic that we can really identify?
I, and in working with people who are really feeling either unsettled where they are, or recognizing they need to make a pivot, or realizing they have to possibly reinvent themselves again, I'm I'm really keen on people paying attention to work the way one does with relationships. Just because somebody wants to date you doesn't mean you should go out to dinner. Does mean you could have a coffee, but you really do have to figure out whether you should have dinner with them. And there are a lot of people I've worked with who've said yes to roles or to interviews and later regretted going there, as one example. Wherever you go, you're going to spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day working with people that will totally subsume your time from spending time with people you love, your family, your child, your partner, whoever that is. It's really important that you do your due diligence into culture, your sense of awareness of what it feels like while you're being interviewed, taking calculated risk. I am very big on not doing rebounds. I'm one of the only people I know that resigned from a job without another job lined up, and I did it twice. And I was lucky enough that it worked out for me. I don't think that is the best. I don't think that should be your first alternative. I think you should create bridges. I'm very big on bridges. I think that while you're working in your current role, wherever you are, you continue to act as if you may want to transition 6 months, a year, 2 years. You keep up having conversations with people. You're not always out there interviewing, but you're just getting in touch always with what is it that would feel great if you're not feeling it today.
Yeah.
And so you're not in a position to rebound.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
You're in a position to date. You're dating.
You're dating, and you're not running toward anything. You're being selective with where you're applying your energy, where you're applying your interest, and you're a little bit harder to get. And I do think that comes through to employers.
Totally.
When you're looking around, who wants to go on a date with a person who's always available for a date? Like there's a little chase.
Swiping right. It's like,
exactly.
At the end of the day, have conversations, stay in touch, and find out if you're feeling a little uncomfortable. Find out what else is out there. Get some emotional distance.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's a hard thing to do, and it's very subjective. And sometimes I work with people on trying to figure out how they can get some emotional distance, because when you're really caught at work and you're ruminating all the time, and maybe you don't care for your boss, or maybe you're feeling slighted, maybe you didn't get promoted, all of those things, that may be the first sign of a cosmic shove, of something that says, maybe I shouldn't date them anymore. But that doesn't mean you head for the exit. It means you start doing a pragmatic approach to, how much money do I have saved?
You start packing in secret, Mary.
Exactly. You pack in secret. And it's not even necessarily, this whole quiet quitting moment.
No.
It's really about taking stock of what you have to offer, if you're getting to live that every day, if you enjoy the culture, if you think, if it aligns with your values, whatever those are, and take your time to do your due diligence before you get to the point that you have to run to the exit. That's
and I've also,
feeling.
I've experienced that thing where you're there and you're like, okay, what's the next step above where I am today? And you look at it and you're like, I don't fucking want that. Like, I don't want my boss's job. I don't want, And so then what? So it's like, oh shit, now I need to start to evaluate like what the thing is that I want, because the obvious step is not it. And I think that, there is some level of privilege that comes with that, right? To explore outside of what can feel safe, what can feel certain. But you
Sure.
spoke about the cosmic shove. And I think that there comes a point too where you try to, luxuriate or sit in your feels for a little longer, and then you're not given the choice. And I mean,
Right.
especially right now, many industries have been turned upside down with
Oh my
layoffs. It's
God.
been very thematic. I mean, where there are kind of opportunities that maybe aren't your first choice. And you talk about bridging. So maybe this is a great opportunity to connect or to bridge that, if you will. But I think that a lot of people are in positions where the market is very saturated with available talent, and people who haven't been hireable in years or haven't been
Yeah.
looking in years are suddenly on a full job search.
Yeah.
What advice do you give to those who were maybe not as enthused with what they were doing before? And I have thoughts on this too. I'm very curious to hear what yours are. Do they apply the skill set of the role that they were laid off from, or do they use that as an opportunity to make that grand pivot?
I think the first step, which is going to sound really remedial, is to really dive into what is most important to you right now, today, in this moment. And when I do that exercise with people, and it can take a while for them to arrive at the right place, it's often money. Because they aren't going to retire for another 10 or 15 years, because they have obligations, they have kids who have yet to go to college. They
cost
have
of
mortgage,
living keeps going up.
Cost of living.
Yeah, totally.
They want to keep up with their partner's salary so that they can take the vacation, once a year abroad, whatever it is. And my point in bringing that up is getting very clear on what is most important so that you're not stressing about those really important things later as you begin to evaluate what's right. Because if you take a job that feels really like a dream come true and you have a lot of passion for it and it's a complete pivot and you're making 40% of what you used to make, that wonderful feeling is going to go away within 6 months.
That's right.
Because you're not sustaining something that actually deep down inside was more important, which was sustaining a certain income. And I'm not saying money has to be the generator. I'm saying that if money is number 5, that's awesome. God bless that. That's great. Because then you have the leverage to really look at 1 to 4 and say, I'm going to take some time off. I'm going to really evaluate who I interview with. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z amount of networking. And you may have a little more privilege to do all that.
It sounds like a trust fund or a severance package, either one. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And so absent that, you have to create bridges. And it may be, I've had people say, but I just don't want to do this anymore. But they're unsure what they want to do. And I'm like, what if you did it for a year? Knowing that throughout that entire year, you were building bridges elsewhere so that you can really put it in your past.
I agree. And I think that for others too, when you're in a position where you want to make a shift, I often advise, it's about looking at your own experience, and maybe you haven't actually gutted your resume in 3 years because you just keep adding shit on top of it. And then what's on the bottom, it's like, we all literally or figuratively swept the floors of the studios we worked in.
Sure.
If I don't want to do that again, I better not put that on my resume, because someone's going to go, oh, Lauren's a great studio sweeper. Let's get her to do this. And all of a sudden you're doing the shit that you didn't want to do anymore again. So I really believe in not making up, a bunch of lies.
Yeah,
I really believe in framing your experience in a way that feels applicable to the thing that's next, even if the connection isn't obvious. If you're amazing at sales and you want to go into more of a marketing focus, you can really tell that story of like how selling has really helped you to, build up a campaign to actually generate interest and revenue, because that's ultimately the goal of marketing, right? But if it's a bigger pivot and you're wanting to go from being a coach to being a designer, maybe it's a little less obvious. And maybe it's something that you're like, well, I've designed these websites. I've, worked on branding for these smaller, clients of mine. Maybe you put yourself in a position where you're able to take some freelance projects on and you're able to experiment. Do I actually want to spend let's say 8 hours a day. I mean, we know there's no such thing as a 9 to 5.
No.
Do I actually want to spend my days doing this? Because sometimes you think you want to do the thing that's the big pivot and you get a little taste of it and you're like, oh, nope, I definitely don't want to do this.
Right.
And I think that, even for me, I mean, that was like when I was specifically in the training and development, learning and development role. I love building out trainings and modules and learning. I am at my core, I'm a coach, I'm an HR professional. I love recruiting. I love that whole space. Learning and development as a standalone job was not it for me. And I was like, whoa, I'm so bored. And I think that's okay, to be honest. But before you dive in headstrong into something that you're like, this is going to be the next 5 years, realizing that it might just be a stopping point. It might be a lily pad that you're just pausing on while you evaluate what the next jump is.
Sure.
And I think going back to your relationships analogy, I spent so much time and energy thinking everything had to be a long-term relationship.
Right.
Every job I took had to be like, this is my boo for a long, long time, 5 years minimum. We're moving in together and we're combining something.
Yeah.
That is not what it is. And I got great advice from somebody. I remember when I was forced to make a change, earlier in my career, I was fired. I mean, that was not my choice. I really evaluated and I was like, well, I want to find the right thing. I was really obsessed. I only want to be in these industries. I only want to work for this type of company.
Sure.
One of my friends, he said to me, he was like, what if you just did something short term?
Exactly.
What if you just went into something and said, this doesn't have to be the long-term thing. It might just be a pause. And that's what I ended up doing that led me to consulting. And it was such an interesting journey because if I hadn't had that temporary, I'll call it experience, I wouldn't have found that that in fact was absolutely not what I wanted to do. I wanted to consult. I wanted to move into that space, but I was afforded that opportunity while still earning income because I didn't have the luxury of just saying, let me just go off of vibes and go to yoga class and see if it comes to me, when I'm in Savasana.
Million%. And I think that takes a certain amount of kind of brave ambition for oneself to really recognize that what you're doing at any given moment is not your full identity. I think it's harder for people who really identify with what they do in their career to the degree that it's very hard for them to release the grip a little bit to think of other possibilities. And so it's not the same for everybody, but it is really important to recognize that for example, I've worked with people when I was at Conde Nast because I worked in so many large teams and at various brands. On more than one occasion, somebody would say, well, I can't do that because that feels like I'm going back a step if I take that title.
Sure.
And I find that so myopic because if that brand or that company is going to present you with something that's a lot more aligned with your values or your interests or your creative thinking or your skills, to not go back a little bit. And I'm not saying you take like a 30% pay cut, but, to maybe take a title below what you currently have and to see what that possibility is where you can be nurtured in an environment that seems really appealing and that would feel really great is really myopic. And I highly recommend people check their identity a little bit when they're evaluating opportunity, because you never know where the opportunity is going to come from. I was bartending when I got into media. I remember when I was at Vogue and I had resigned after 4 years, I didn't know where I was going to go. And I gave them a few months' notice, so I had time to do my research and network and do all those things. And when I went to Vanity Fair, my first title there was a title I hadn't had in over a decade. However, it was a brand I revered and had been reading for ever. And I love the thought leadership and I love the cultural references. I love the history. I loved all of it. And I accepted that with about a $25,000 pay cut and a lower title. Within 6 months, I got promoted. And 6 months later than that, I was the number 2 there. And it just, I was so excited to be there that you couldn't hold me back from, showing up in my best way every day. It was the right move for me. And that's why I tell people to just breathe a little bit
Mm.
through possibility, because you may end up exactly where you're meant to be and really happy.
Well, and I think that there's a great, example there. I mean, I'm fanatical about cars and
Mm-hmm.
I drive stick, which is great if you live in New York, nobody
I
can borrow your
learned
car,
on a stick.
Exactly. So if you really want to go fast, you have to downshift. You have
Yep.
to downshift
It's a
to
great
actually be able to
metaphor.
propel yourself forward. It allows you to rev up your engine. It sounds sexy, and then you get to gun it. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a thing that we don't think about is sometimes that downshift allows us to prepare for that super acceleration.
Sure.
And I think, I remember I had a client who I was working with and she took a title below where she, had been for several years.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, Lauren, I don't mind if they feel like they got a little bit of a deal on me because I'm going to shatter their
Oh yeah.
expectations.
Yeah.
And
That's awesome.
I thought it was such a great attitude, and
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't a huge pay cut. It was a little bit of a pay
Sure.
cut, but also as someone I can say as a people leader who's been in the room when we're drafting job descriptions hundreds and thousands of times in my career,
Mm.
titles are bullshit.
Yeah.
Titles are created sometimes without even thinking. Now,
I
some
know.
companies are super specific. There's a career ladder, and a director at a
Oh
large,
yeah.
tech
Oh yeah.
company means something totally different than a director at perhaps a small advertising agency. So getting past the title, look at the career trajectory. Look at what you can do. Who else has that title in the company?
Totally.
And look at who your peers will be. Look at who's, if you're being hired as a director and you're looking at a vice president, what does that look like? Are you like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I have way more experience than them? Well, guess what? If you go in as a director, you're going to blow past and you're going to get promoted and you're
Mm-hmm.
going to grow. It's also a good litmus if you go into a director role and you're killing it and your feedback and performance reviews are great and you're not getting promoted. Maybe it's time to start to examine what's out there because maybe
Right.
they're not valuing you. And I think that's also, it doesn't have to be forever. You can take a
Mm-hmm.
step back to rev up, right? But if you're not given the opportunity to accelerate, if there's traffic on the highway and you can't get an open lane, then you can have that conversation with yourself of
Yeah.
like, where do I bring this for the next step?
I've definitely, I was talking to somebody recently and found out that there was somebody on their team who was a senior vice president. And I looked at their LinkedIn to get familiar with them, and I realized they've been in the job market about 11 years.
Mm.
And I thought, what is unknown to people is the higher your title, the narrower the focus, the less opportunity, because it is considered a privileged place to get that high and accomplished in your career. And you won't be considered for roles that you might be completely aligned with skill-wise if you're always looking for an elevated title, because people will think, oh, they're too advanced, or they're only going to need to make this much money.
Mm.
And, being an SVP at a company with 10 people is not the same as being an SVP in an industry where there are only, 4 vice presidents who've been working for 25 years.
Yes.
You may be limiting yourself ultimately by really thinking solely about things like title.
Yeah. And
Go
I
for
always,
experience. What is it offering
exactly.
you?
Yes. Is there something that you're really excited about that you haven't gotten to do in
Yeah.
your career? And I often ask people that, and I know you do too, early on in, in a conversation of what's next for you. It's like,
Exactly.
what haven't you gotten to do yet?
Yeah.
Cause you're going to get asked that when you're interviewing somewhere. You're going to ask yourself that when you're interviewing somewhere, I hope. And I think it's like, what haven't you gotten to do that you're kind of itching to get into that environment? Or what did you have a taste of earlier that you're like, I just keep thinking about that hors d'oeuvre that we had. Let's go back to the restaurant. And I think
Exactly.
that's the thing that people forget is they think it has to be the same because we've created what is, I don't agree with career laddering in the sense that it has to be linear. I mean,
Right.
you likely don't as well based on your experience,
Yeah, totally.
right? And I think that having those different, I look for that. If I'm looking to hire an amazing, executive assistant for somebody, I'm thinking, have you worked in hospitality? Have you worked in a luxury environment?
Totally.
Do you know how to be a bar raiser? It's not about, have you been an EA for 10 years? Because
No.
that might mean that we have to teach you how to unlearn a lot of bad habits,
That's 1,000,000%. When I remember when I was at Vanity Fair, and my 2 of the people who reported to me were advertising directors, and they had made a couple of poor choices in their assistant.
Mm.
So they were a little shy of pulling the lever on somebody and saying, this is the one. And they both came into my office sheepishly one day and said, would you meet our candidate? And I'm like, oh, for God's sakes. I'm like, you can't figure this out. And they're like, we're worried we're going to make the mistake again. And you have really good radar. Anyway, enters this young woman, about 27 years old, very taken by herself, very comfortable, sat on the couch in my office, almost laid down, looked cute, had a cute vintage Chanel bag, et cetera and so forth, very charmed with herself. And I had her in my office maybe 10 minutes, and then I, had her exit.
You said that's enough. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I went into their offices. They were like, so what'd you think? And I said, are you out of your mind? Do you know how bored she will be doing in Excel? Do you know how overly confident she is and how she comports herself if we have to put her in front of senior leadership? I said, what in God's name did you ask her on this interview? Because she's really charismatic and charming. I said, but that's not what this role is.
Right.
And, it's kind of interesting because I said, hire for having peripheral vision. Find out if they've ever worked on a team, if they've ever had to, the right hand has to know what the left is doing. Find out if they've ever been in a chorus and they sang this while the other side of the room sang that. I said, hire for people, to your point, who've actually had to have a job before, maybe. Hire for that. Hire for someone who doesn't know all these skills, but is invested in saying, well, how do you do it?
Yes. And I think one thing I end up, coaching a lot of like company clients on is specifically mitigating that bias that we have. People are like, I don't know what it is about Mary, but I would just love to get a drink with her. And, just a great vibe. I could just totally see us, clicking.
Totally.
And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Did we write a job description for your bestie? Because I'm pretty sure that you asked for someone who can do X, Y, and Z. Did you even ask those questions? And so writing interview questions is a huge thing. I come up with interview question matrices, and people end up looking at them and going, oh, I never considered asking all the candidates the same questions. It's as simple as that, right? Because then all of a sudden you have responses to measure against each other. Does it hold up? Are we missing something entirely? Oh, nobody remembered to ask this person about manager skills, and they're going to be managing a team of 20. We need to know what kind of people manager they are, right?
Exactly. A 1,000,000%. It's true. There are so many people who are like, but I really like them. I'm like, I probably want to have a drink with her, but I wouldn't want her like needing to show up on time and making sure she's helping you get out the door to present something to B&W.
Yeah. And that's the thing. That's the thing that I think people, forget, is that often when they're interviewing, I push back on interviewers if I'm interviewing for something and they're just asking me like life questions. I'm like, first of all, that might not be legal. So tread lightly. Yeah. But also, let me tell you a little bit about me. And I've become really good at, actually, if someone's not asking me enough about myself, I'll make them listen anyways. I'll figure out a way to weave it in there. You'll get a whole dose, but other people might not be as confident. So do you have like a skill set that you could maybe speak to that someone could work on if they're trying to build their confidence when interviewing for an opportunity? There's
something really specific that I think I have had a number of clients tell me is really helpful. Most people outside of politicians will say, really don't have a great time talking about themselves or the narcy friend in our life. They're not comfortable talking about themselves. And often when they get asked to explain their experience, they end up, giving some sort of chronology, which is right there on their resume. Well, I started here and then I went there and then I did this. And it's not really giving the full breadth of what you're capable of. So I definitely practice with people on talking about what you're inspired by right now. What about the role is interesting to you? What motivates you? Let people know how you think. Different than this is where I was and this is what I did. Then you come across as somebody who's just a doer. People want to hire and work with other people who are interesting in how they think. It'll win every day over another. So if somebody wants to know, tell me about your role at X company. What drew me to that role was X. The reason is I'm very inspired by working in teams. I love managing people. It's not everybody's jam, but being able to help mentor and shepherd people to make the best decisions, and at the end of the day, realize you've closed a significant amount of business because you've helped guide that. That is enough that makes my week. A lot more interesting than sales went up 14% while I was doing X, Y, and Z. They can see all that. Let them know
Thank
how
you for
you
saying
think.
that. Yes.
Let them know how
And I
you
think
think.
and if they want data, they'll ask for it. So be prepared.
Exactly.
I mean, if you're interviewing
Totally.
and you'll probably be asked if you're a manager, how big the teams were that you led, or how much growth did you experience at the company? Or if you're in sales, they might ask you about the revenue that you generated. But I think at the end of the day, talking about the qualitative accomplishments, I hate when people call them soft skills because they're anything but I think what are the things about you that make you the person that's different than everybody else interviewing for the role? Because you have to believe that, especially in a competitive market, I'll say, companies as buyers, it's like real estate. It's a buyer's market,
Sure.
For them. But if you're the one coming in, what makes you unique? What's like your,
9%.
differentiation that you can offer that they haven't even considered was a possibility? And I think that comes from doing your research about the role, asking questions like, is this a new hire or is this a backfill? Was there somebody in this position before? If so, what are we hoping for to be different this time around? It's never going to be a 1-for-1, And I think that way they'll give you the recipe that they're looking for. I mean, my dad was a chef, and he once told me that lied his way into a role as a chef at a restaurant, because he went in and they said, have you made this? Have you made that? He had. And then they said, well, have you made this before? He had no idea what they were talking about. Okay. He was like, yes, I have.
Amazing.
And he said, but I have a question. I know there's a couple different approaches, when you're making this specific dessert. So which way do you approach for the restaurant so I can make it in your style? Well, those idiots showed him exactly how to make it, and he just watched, learned, changed a couple things, and made his own. I mean, for you, if you're interviewing and they're speaking to something that you have not been able to do yet, I bet you've done something that aligns with it. So be creative and really think on your feet.
1,000,000%.
Give yourself a couple of hype up notes, put them on the side of your desktop or on your phone or wherever you're going to see them, and remind yourself why you are that person, why you are the person who should be hired into the role. It's not about the discomfort that you might be feeling. It's about telling them why you can get past that discomfort to be that person they need to hire.
1,000,000%. I applaud all of that, and your father's brave ambition for himself to be like, no, I'm right for this. Sure, I can do it.
I mean, it is funny because you think about it, and we're all kind of in our own kitchen trying to whip up recipes with, invested ingredients that have been our career.
Totally.
I mean, have you ever, as a coach, inadvertently given someone bad career advice?
My goal is not to give advice.
I love that.
Because 95% of advice is not taken. It also isn't, it really, I can give advice to my partner. She ignores me also. So, at the end of the day, it's not about advice. The only time I give advice, and I do mention this to people when they interview me, is if I think you're going to do something really dumb. And I always qualify it by saying, this is not coaching, this is mentoring. Don't go in and tell your CEO to go fuck themselves. Like, don't do it. Don't go into the CEO and credential yourselves when you've never had a meeting with him before. If they're granting you a meeting, there's another way to prepare for that.
Yes.
So that's the only time I really give advice. I do try to encourage people to take a certain amount of, to be vulnerable enough to focus on maybe some blind spots.
Yeah.
And areas of development that will help them. And those are, I ask permission to be candid. And I did it yesterday with a young woman who's really very bright, and her company hired her. One of the reasons is she uses a lot of disinfluencing words. So every other word is like or and this is a common thing. Encouraging her to slow it down. But I asked, do I have permission to be candid? We need to work on this because it will diffuse your ability to sound authoritative.
Yes.
When you're working with senior leadership. And this is about energy and comportment.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I think that, it's often, comes at the cost of historically excluded communities, whatever that is.
Yeah.
But
Oh, yeah.
and I think it can be generational. I mean, to me, like doesn't bother me because for one, I think I say it a lot myself, but also, I think that it's okay if someone speaks in a way that is
Mm-hmm.
comfortable for them. If they're comfortable, I'm okay with it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that also expanding our own aperture of what is professional, because
Million
the
percent.
word professionalism is chaotic. I mean, it
Yeah,
is so subjective. It is so
totally.
steeped in really challenging, kind of what our
Mm-hmm.
ideals are as individuals. And some people haven't had the privilege of going into those situations and not being viewed in one way or the other. But I think
Totally.
that what we're speaking to is maybe more a little bit about, being open to that kind candor, being open to
Yeah.
evolving
Mm-hmm.
and, working on things. If I find that I say a word too many times when I listen back to recordings, I write it down and I'm like, try to stop saying amazing. I can't. I love it.
Right.
It's my favorite
I
word.
know. I actually use it all the time too. You and I can have an amazing conversation often
About amazing topics and we'll
about
feel
amazing
amazing
topics.
afterwards.
Exactly. Amazing.
Definitely.
There's
I mean,
lots of
I
ways to
think
spell it even.
yes, and we can also be kind with ourselves. And I just
Yeah.
laugh when I say amazing. I have a little chuckle in my own head, and maybe somebody
Sure.
picks up on it, maybe they don't. But I think that we're able to also accept feedback from others, and I think there is some
Yeah.
sensitivity that I've noticed, especially when working with more junior folks around taking feedback. And one thing I do as a
Mm.
leader, and I think it's great. I'm not here to just dole out advice, but hey, I think this is a good one. Is
Mm.
when you're taking somebody new into your team, you're taking on a new coaching client, you're taking on a new relationship, ask that person how they like to receive feedback.
Million
Ask them
percent.
early and
Mm-hmm.
check in. Like, it's not about like, how can I make you upset? But it is about how do you like to receive feedback? And I always ask, how do you like to receive praise? Because
Yeah.
some people would find it to be the most mortifying thing in the world if I shout them out in a team meeting and say, Mary did an amazing job with this. I want to talk about it. You
Mm-hmm.
would rather die. I mean, that could be the most
Definitely.
humiliating thing in the world. Now, if it's me, I'm like, if you could give me a trophy when you say that in the team meeting, I would love it. I want that praise.
Yeah.
That's how I like it. I'd make it loud, make it, everyone should know that's me. But that's okay. But
Yeah.
when it comes to giving feedback, some people want it right in the moment, right when they say the thing, right after the thing happens. And others say, I need you to give me a heads up because if you put a meeting on the calendar at 4 o'clock on Thursday and it's Monday, all week I'm going to agonize. And I
Yeah.
just want to know what's coming. And so I think being really mindful of how the people that we're working with take praise and feedback is going to make us so much better for it.
Such a good point. I've worked with a lot of time. Leadership will hire me to work with somebody who's mid-level management because they have a hard time accepting feedback. I also have worked with CEOs who have a hard time giving feedback.
Yes.
And it's important, no matter what role you're in, to understand communication skills. How to manage up is really important, but it's also important to know how to manage down and around you. And giving feedback is critical. And giving constructive feedback does not necessarily mean criticism. It's just there to help move you along in a way that would be beneficial, maybe for your role, the company, your career, whatever it is. And there are definitely people who have a really, really hard time. And asking the question that you're saying is super, super important. Super important. It opens the door for somebody who hasn't thought about it to really think about, well, how am I with getting feedback? And I often have to explain that it's not judgment. There is discernment if you're giving proper feedback to somebody that you care. It's an expression of care if given well, and
Yeah.
given in a skilled way.
Yeah. And I think
Really
also
awesome.
being vulnerable about what we're working on can be a really big game changer. I've learned, and sometimes it's not appropriate. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say it like it is. Like, not
Yeah.
everyone needs to know everything you're working on, but if
Yeah.
you're like, I'm really working on being more confident speaking up in meetings. let people know, whether they're your peers, if you're comfortable being like, I'm really working on this, they will open the doors for you, or they'll make sure you don't get steamrolled when everyone else is jumping in. They'll say, oh, wait, you know what? I think Lauren had something to say. And I think that knowing what those are, and you can work in private. I think that's totally okay. But if you want to share it vulnerably, I think that's a great opportunity for you to also let the people around you know, this is something I'm working on. And it also helps when we come to like calibrations and feedback sessions, when we're doing performance reviews. Those people might be in the room weighing in on how you perform. And if they're aware of what you're working on, and they can speak to not just the thing they knew you were working on, but that you've transcended, then all of a sudden you've grown. And that is not always so obvious in corporate environments. And so I think it's good to call it out if you have the opportunity.
Yeah. Oh my God, I love that. That's absolutely true. And I really do appreciate what you're saying about praise as well, and asking people how they receive it. I did consult for a company that whenever it was someone's birthday, the entire room would applaud. And there were some people who thrived on it. And there was always a handful that was like, oh my God, please make the applause stop. You could see it all over their body. You could see the fact that they were breaking out in like a red rash, because the applause was actually meant to go on for not like a few minutes. It would go on for 5 and 6 and 7 minutes.
Oh, that sounds intense.
And it was intense. And every time I witnessed it, I thought, this feels intimidating for some people. And it's an interesting thing what you bring up, because there are some people who aren't really comfortable with being acknowledged broadly, loudly, publicly. It's hard for them. And respectfully, if you care about them, you want to do it in a way that they can really receive it. Communication is always about how somebody's going to receive it. Otherwise, it's not communication. It's just an opinion.
Yeah. And regardless if you had good intent, right? Regardless if the intent was good to celebrate them, you might be bringing them back to a difficult childhood memory at Cold Stone Creamery where they would have rather died than had them sing a song when they tipped. You just never know. Maybe that happened to me. I don't know.
Maybe.
Yes, maybe so. One thing that I wanted to make sure we touched on while we have our time together, you mentioned this when we were talking about topics for our conversation. I'm super intrigued. It's the gift of tricky. What do you mean by this?
I have found that those situations in my life and my career that were really challenging or tricky, career itself and tricky, have later been the thing that I can call upon to help me navigate something else. We all, if we're alive, we're going to encounter really difficult things. Some of them will be even tragic, or some of them will be devastating. It may be the first time you get fired. It may be a boss who demeans you. It may be a layoff of a role that you really, really loved, but downturn in the economy, or what happened in the tech industry in the last year. So many people were laid off who love their roles. Those moments in the moment are painful. Those moments in the moment call upon extraordinary vulnerability. But at a certain point, it's important to stop marinating in what happened and think about what you can learn from it so that you can move forward and to realign your focus. And it usually takes a long time to look back on it and say, that was actually a gift, because after I left there, I met so-and-so, and now I'm in like the best position of my career. It is the gift of tricky. When I was leaving Vogue, after 4 years, I was working for somebody who was very complicated. And it was 2008, and there was a big downturn in the economy. There was a lot of change in business. I was the American fashion director on the business side. A lot of business was, the investments weren't as high. Companies were pulling back on advertising and marketing. And it became extraordinarily stressful. And I worked for somebody who at one point actually said to me, I need to break you. And I remember leaving her office and thinking later, it's time to go. Because I'm not a horse. And we didn't have horses in the Bronx where I grew up. So I was really unfamiliar. And I wasn't going to stay around to be ridden. And I had disagreed with her about something in the midst of all this stress. And I held on to those words for a really long time. And I have to be honest, if I hadn't left when I resigned and I gave 2 months notice, and then they asked would I stay for a third, and I did stay for a third, and they said to me, you really don't have another job lined up. I said, I don't. I'm breaking up with you. Those were the words that came out of my mouth because it did feel like a relationship. I would not have gone to Vanity Fair and had what was a highlight of my career and had a great opportunity. But the thing about, having something like that said to me was amazing as I work with people right now who are having a hard time not feeling victimized by toxic bosses, as an example. Mm-hmm. And realizing that at some point, there is an opportunity in all of those gifts. And it was a gift that she said that to me. It actually was. In the moment, it felt pretty bad. But later, it enabled me to really shore up the courage to do something about it and do something different. And, if you really look back on the most troubling times in your life, especially in your career, you usually can find an opportunity that you glean from it. And it brought you to a much better place. 90% of the time.
Behold the gift of tricky. That is tricky. It really is. I think and you're right, those words that sting and you carry them around with you and you're like, ooh, this is bad. If you can turn it into something that has propelled you forward and reminds you of why you won't go back, that is the gift. Absolutely.
I'll tell you the gift of that. I was consulting for a company, an agency, and the founder was acting out in a meeting, and I was in the meeting, and I found her behavior to be really intolerable. And I felt on the receiving end of it with a group of people, even though it had nothing to do with me. But I was like, why am I lumped into this? I'm a consultant. Left the room, went back to my area at this place, and I packed everything up. And her assistant looked at me and said, are you leaving? I said, uh-huh. And she said, are you leaving? I said, I am. And she was like, oh my God. And the reason is it resembled the behavior from, I don't know how many years earlier, 10 years earlier of my previous boss. I said, no. And I know that gift in the beginning really called upon me to have the self-esteem and also the self-confidence and also the self-respect to not tolerate really, inappropriate behavior professionally. I'm not tolerating. I'm not going to sit in a room and watch people be demeaned, actually. I'm going to leave. And then, she called later that night at 7:30 and begged me not to leave. And we readjusted what my remit was because I said, this is not okay.
And I hope you adjusted your rate. Yeah.
All of it.
It's going up.
Anyway, my point is it was the gift of, that was very tricky in 2008. Mm. But in 2018, it was the gift.
I love that. It's wild we're coming up on time because I think we could probably do part 2, part 3, part 4, and part 5. Let's talk, where can people learn a little bit more about you, Mary?
I have a website, mccoachingnyc.com. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn.
Yes, you are.
I enjoy doing a podcast. I occasionally do public speaking on women in leadership and the import of advancing women in businesses and in careers, because it is a scary small pipeline for women in leadership. And that's pretty much it. That's how you can find me. Otherwise, you're just going to see a lot of dog pictures on Instagram. So,
also here for the dog pictures.
Dog and cat pictures.
Absolutely. You can't leave out the kitty. Totally.
Yeah. One-eyed Julie. Yeah. OEJ. Hashtag OEJ.
Julie. Oh my God. Mary, what is one final thought you want to leave our listeners with today?
Oh my goodness.
We've covered a lot, so I feel like there's a whole platter to choose from.
I would say, and this is not inspiring, but I do find myself saying it regularly, deep breath. It's really important when you wake up in the morning and you realize that you're mourning something. You're grieving something was disrupted, your career is not what you thought it would be, your career is not what it was 2 years ago. you made a misstep, you made a mistake, you misspoke in a meeting, all of those moments. Just take a deep breath. We're human beings. You'll do better next time. It isn't a judgment on whether you're valuable. It is not a judgment on whether you're skilled. It is certainly not an assessment of your talent. Shit happens. You'll have an opportunity next time not to fuck it up. It's okay.
I love that.
It is okay.
It is okay. You know what? Let's take a deep breath together.
It's okay.
That felt good.
It's okay.
Mary, thank you so much.
Oh
this
my
has
God,
been
you are my
another
pleasure.
episode of Don't Fuck This Up, the podcast answering the ultimate question, how the fuck did you land that cool job? I'm your host, Lauren Alvarez, and we'll talk to you next week.
My pleasure.
Don't Fuck This Up is a podcast written, produced, and edited by Lauren Alvarez. New episodes dropping every Wednesday. Be sure to follow, rate, and review this and every episode. And until next week, please keep it together and try your best not to fuck this up.